Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Inform Your Patient Experience Through Workflow. This webinar is hosted by FormStack, and we're excited to be joined today by healthcare workflow expert Dr. Chuck Webster, along with our very own Andrew Clark, Chief of Staff. I'm Lainey Langford, and before we get started, I want to give you a few more details about FormStack. First off, we're a tech company based in Indianapolis, Indiana, with employees and users across the globe. FormStack offers a HIPAA-compliant online form building solution that gives organizations the ability to easily collect, manage, and share healthcare information across any device. We help our users reduce inefficient processes and create exceptional patient experiences. As you can probably tell from the name, this webinar will cover workflow, which is a critical component of healthcare data collection. Dr. Webster and Andrew Clark are going to share expert tips for automating your healthcare management tasks, and with their advice, you'll learn a few things. First, how to create and implement efficient workflows at your organization. Second, how to build forms that will help shape the patient experience. And third, how to improve your paper-based processes while maintaining HIPAA compliance. If you have any questions during the webinar, go ahead and post those in the chat section in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. We'll try our best to address them during the webinar or after during the Q&A section. Also note that this webinar is being recorded, and we will email the presentation to everyone within the next few days. All right, the first thing I'll tell you about Dr. Webster is that he's one of the most Twitter-savvy people that I've ever met, which has earned him a spot as a social media ambassador for HIMSS for the last several years. We'd love for you to join the conversation on Twitter, so we created a hashtag that you can use to communicate your thoughts and questions during the webinar. As you can see on the screen, the hashtag is FormStackWorkflow. And we've also provided Twitter handles for FormStack and Dr. Webster, so feel free to use those to connect with us during the webinar as well. In just a few minutes, we're going to turn the webinar over to Dr. Webster for the first half, but I wanted to share a little bit more about our speakers today. Dr. Webster is actually joining us from Portugal today, and he has degrees in accountancy, industrial engineering, intelligent systems, and medicine. He designed the first undergraduate program in medical informatics, was a software architect at a hospital MIS department, and also VP and Chief Medical Informatics Officer for an EHR vendor for over 10 years. He is now a social media ambassador for HIMSS, like I mentioned, and he also maintains a number of Twitter profiles and websites, including a healthcare business process management blog. We also have Andrew Clark here with us. Andrew is the Chief of Staff at FormStack. He currently works with the product, marketing, and sales teams, along with clients and other leaders in the healthcare industry, to improve our healthcare and workflow offerings. He is passionate about helping healthcare organizations improve the way they serve their patients. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Chuck.
And thank you very much, Lane. I'm delighted to be here to talk about my favorite subject. And yes, I'm on Twitter a lot, so please tweet at me at Wareflow, W-A-R-E-F-L-O, no W at the end, and use the hashtag FormStackWorkflow. So this is my favorite slide in the whole slide deck. Just one slide with a big word, workflow, with an exclamation point at the end. I'm an industrial engineer who went to medical school. And industrial engineering is basically a degree in workflow. So you can see why I do what I do. Okay, workflow is leaving the healthcare organization and actually moving into the patient's world. When I started, I mapped workflows in a student health service and walked around with an old-fashioned stopwatch and calculated times and weights, and then created a computer model of patient flow and task flow. But that was inside an organization, and workflow has just gotten more and more important in healthcare. But it's now coming out of the hospital, even out of the medical center, and folks are actually studying the workflows of patients. And they're seeing how, sometimes they call them life flows, but they're seeing how these workflows interact with the health system workflows. In this diagram, which comes from a presentation at the recent Healthcare Systems Process Improvement Conference in Orlando, they are showing a workflow that goes from the top to the bottom on the left and then proceeds up to the top on the right and goes down. So that letter A is connecting it into a continuous workflow. And so the patient wakes up has breakfast, goes to work, and then in the middle in gray we've got gets permission to go to the clinic, goes to the clinic, testing, changes therapy, comes back to work, comes home, decides whether to have dinner at home or whether to go out and take some medication and goes back to sleep. Now, they're gathering various kinds of times, and they're gathering information about patient experience. But what's really interesting about this workflow diagram are the dashed lines. The dashed lines is the information flow that's going back and forth between different steps of the workflow and between the workflow of the patient's life and the workflow of the health system. So folks are actually studying this, and online forms workflow is kind of smack dab in the middle of this kind of exciting development. So what is the form workflow connection? Let's take a look at a bunch of forms. If you Google form or forms, you'll see a whole bunch of stuff that looks like this. So you've probably filled out hundreds, maybe even thousands of forms in your life. They're rectilinear. They have places where you can write stuff. There are labels. And as forms increasingly move into the digital world, we start to see things like this blue form over on the right, where the form doesn't look like the paper version, and as forms move into the digital world, we can change them to make them better, to improve the experience of the person interacting with the forms. For example, using conditional logic so that you don't ask questions that don't make sense. Let's look at a definition. This comes from Wikipedia. And a form is a logically structured document with a fixed arrangement of captioned spaces designed for entering, extracting, and communicating required information. The key phrase here is logically structured. We'll come back to that. So let's pop over to a definition of workflow. I've literally looked at hundreds of definitions of workflow over a number of decades, and I've seen definitions that will fill 2 PowerPoint slides with small text font. This is my definition because it's kind of distilled down to the simplest possible definition, but you can kind of stretch it to be in useful ways. A workflow is a series of steps, consuming resources, achieving goals. So those steps can be activities, tasks, even experiences. So there's the connection to patient experience. Consuming resources, the time of someone that's interacting with it, the cost to have the workflow in the first place, and it's achieving goals. And the goals tend to become the names of the workflow. So if it's a patient registration goal, then it's a patient registration workflow. So workflow also, just like a form, is a logically structured series of steps, activities, or experiences, consuming resources such as personnel time, money, attention, even CPU cycles. That's the thing that the computer does over and over again to execute a program, and the memory in which the program executes to achieve goals, such as registering a patient or collecting survey data. So there's the match between the goals and the name of the workflow. Now, in the midst of working on my speaker notes, I actually tweeted out about this fascinating connection between forms and workflow. And I see this guy, Matthew Loxton. And Matthew Loxton is an expert on knowledge management, deals with forms and workflows all the time. And he replies, "Oh yeah, forms design and routing was my first contact with formal workflow." You can tell a lot about an organization from their forms. And it's got a little smiley there. Formal workflow, that's the logical structure that we were just talking about. So forms actually encode workflow, and forms exist within larger workflows. And that's the important conceptual insight to take away. So let's go back and look at that definition of form. Logically structured document with a fixed arrangement of captioned spaces. In Western society, we tend to read from left to right and scan top to bottom, and we also fill in forms that way. And so you can think of a form as encoding a workflow, a sequence of steps. And forms can have different areas intended to be filled out by different people. So forms exist in terms of routing information. So you might have a form that says at the end, don't fill this out. This is for the office. Or if you're within a healthcare organization, that last step might be to escalate to someone who then signs off and says, okay, we'll purchase this equipment. It was above a certain amount, so I had to get involved. Okay, Slight change of pace here. I want to talk about a relay race, and we'll make the connection back to forms in a moment. Relay race is a track and field sport consisting of a number of legs. Each one is run by a different member of the team, and as a runner finishes one stage, they pass the baton to the next, while both are running in that marked exchange zone. During the Summer Olympics, the relay race is my favorite race to watch because it's all about successful, coached, structured teamwork. In fact, the two things that I really love are, on one hand, there's this collective sigh when the baton is dropped. And then also there's this vicarious feeling of positive satisfaction when that second or third or fourth runner perfectly matches speed and they snap that baton into the palm of the next one. In fact, the relay race has become an extremely popular metaphor for successful teamwork. If you just Google teamwork and relay race, you'll see all kinds of content out there where folks are saying, what can we learn from relay races? And part of the reason that relay races are so popular, especially in the United States as a model for teamwork, is the United States is so incredibly successful in that area, in the Olympics. Here in the middle we have a quote. The United States is by far the most dominant nation in the relay race event. In fact, of the last 6 Olympics, they were all won by U.S. women in the 440. That's 4 times 400 meters. And so the relay race is a wonderful metaphor, which I'm going to use. But I'm going to adapt. So everybody's heard of the Special Olympics. Well, this is the special relay race. So in a usual relay race, you have folks competing against each other in different lanes, and folks within the lane are working together. Imagine a kind of a win-win-win relay race in which the patient is in one lane, the staff is in another lane, and the systems are in another lane, and they're all interacting. And the goal is to get the patient across the finish line as quickly and as happily and as efficiently as possible. Now, here we see the little dashed lines again, which we saw earlier. Those dashed lines is information and tasks and interactions. And usually the patient is interacting with the staff, and then the staff interacts with the systems, and then the staff gets back to the patient. But today we have a new wrinkle, and this is happening across industries. More and more healthcare enterprises are literally, virtually turning themselves inside out. They're taking those back-end workflows and they're exposing it through apps. And folks such as the younger generation, they don't want to have to go someplace when all they have to do is log in at 5 a.m. in the morning on their smartphone in bed in the morning during a bout of insomnia. Similarly, they don't want to talk to anybody. So this is a trend that's happening across the board, and it's coming to healthcare. An online form workflow is an example of that, what's becoming called a digital touch point. So I'm an industrial engineer, and we talk about swim lanes, and swim lanes have their own special notation, and I didn't want to make this too overly technical. But the swimmers don't pass batons, at least that I know of, so I kind of changed it a little bit. But here we have 3 swim lanes. They go from left to right. So we've got the patient workflow. The patient is executing a series of steps, experiencing a series of things, and that consumes their resources and achieves their goals. The staff is doing the same thing. That's the workflow of the staff in the middle. And then at the bottom we have workflows or processes where registration systems are talking to electronic health records, which are talking to billing systems. And those dashed lines are the traditional dashed lines. The patients call the staff interacts with the back-end system, the staff gets back to the patient. And the overall goal is for these workflows to execute as quickly and seamlessly and in an successful and efficient and happy fashion as possible. Today, we have a new set of options, and that is increasingly patients are interacting directly with these back-end systems. And online form workflows is probably one of the most popular or most effective means by which this occurs. And that is opening up all kinds of interesting new options. In fact, I want to relate this specifically to, you may have heard of customer journey or patient journey. So this is happening, this is close enough to healthcare, but it's also a little bit outside of healthcare, so you can see that healthcare is part of a larger movement in which people are mapping out the customer journey and the interaction between the customers and these other swim lanes. So this case, we have a daughter in New York who's concerned about her mom in Florida, and she wants to get one of those buttons you press, help, I've fallen and I can't get up. And we have some steps here. Initiate contact, evaluate options, order service, install service, billing, and we have associated emotional states, worried, overwhelmed, relieved, anxious, frustrated. And then off on the right, we have the sales process, the delivery process, the servicing process, and we have these dashed lines of interactions. And folks are re-engineering their back-end systems and exposing them to interact more directly with the patient so as to be more efficient, but also provide a better experience. So let's talk a little bit about the so-called digitally powered patient journey. So here we're zooming in. We're looking at, from left to right, new symptoms, preparing for the patient's visit, the diagnosis, the selecting of the treatment. And now I want you to look at these boxes in terms of color, and I want you to subtract the blue ones. So we're just looking at the beige and the pink ones. So the patient experiences some symptoms, decides to see the physician, sees the physician, there's lab testing. And that's kind of the traditional non-digitally powered patient journey. Now let's put in the blue boxes. The blue boxes are online symptom identification, identifying a physician you can go to, making an appointment, deciding what to ask, looking up what the physician said and understanding it. And it looks like it's making the workflow more complicated. So the workflow is going from the top down on the left, and then it goes back up to the patient interaction and down, and then up to treatment option presentation. And you've got all these blue boxes. Well, these blue boxes, because they are options, they're actually making the workflow better because they're creating options. So instead of having to actually go see someone in order to make a decision or find some information, you can just look it up. And second of all, it's making the interactions, the real-life interactions, better. So looking up the information and being an informed patient before you see the physician makes that real-life interaction more valuable. And similarly, if that information is passed from the patient to the physician, then various kinds of workflows can be queued up to make the overall workflows more efficient and more effective. All right. Now we're going to get to kind of the examples. So I'm looking forward to hearing about these online form workflows. And just like I said, they're the goal. So you want to register a patient, so you have a new patient registration. You want to get permission from them to give the necessary information to the people who need to know it. So you have the HIPAA medical release. The reason that you register that patient in the first place is because you want to kick off workflows. You have to kick off these workflows so that things start to happen in the background in the service of the patient. Similarly, these need to be informed workflows. You may have multiple different possible workflows, but if you get information from that medical history, you may know that this is a chronic disease workflow as opposed to a camp physical workflow in the case of a pediatric interaction. And then, of course, afterwards you want to get that information about the various steps of the workflow, find out what their experience was, where the problems were, so you can systematically improve those workflows and those forms. Now finally, slight change of gear again. I normally don't like to have a wall of small words, but there's a reason here, and that is besides being a workflow analyst, when I was a chief medical informatics officer for an EHR vendor for over a decade, I was also a programmer. So I wrote a lot of code, and one of the things I was responsible for was relationships with third-party products and services. So we might say, you know what, we finally need to have e-prescribing so the doctor can push a button and refill something automatically down at the clinic. So my job was to go out and figure out which platform would work. And the first thing I would look at is kind of like when you go to the hardware store and you decide, oh, I got to buy a toolbox and it's got to be full of tools, and you got to have screwdrivers of different sizes and various kinds of ratchet wrenches, and you don't want to be halfway through the middle of a project and realize you don't have the tool you need. So first of all, I'm kind of impressed if there's a lot of different capabilities. The second thing, there are things that I look for specifically, and the two top things that I looked for in the upper left and the upper right are drag and drop and HIPAA compliance. So HIPAA compliance is kind of like go, no go. It's not HIPAA compliant. We work in a very regulated industry. Look elsewhere. But the drag and drop is interesting because even though I'm a programmer and I enjoy programming, I understand it's really inefficient. It takes a long time to write code to do any little thing. The syntax errors is a problem, and most programmers really don't understand the frontline needs of folks workflow-wise. And so, but you can create something that's close enough, and it's drag and drop. That person then can easily tweak the workflows to systematically improve the forms and the workflows. Those are kind of top of mind. This other stuff is all just kind of bread and butter workflow stuff. Approval workflow, conditional logic, routing, email logic. I mean, you got to be able to get it from point A to B to C, and it's got to be smart and to know based on what was entered where to send it. It has to be integrated into these back-end systems. For those digital touch points to exist, for that dashed line to exist, you've got to have those integrations with, over on the left, you've got the mobile-friendly, the mobile apps. And then finally, I want to mention it is never the case that all workflows work perfectly. And so you need such things as save and resume. So if you're halfway through the workflow, you need to be able to leave and come back. And then over on the right, we've got things like field bottlenecks and partial submissions. You've got to be able to find those problematic areas. So you need what I call kind of workflow analytics. So that you can constantly improve these workflows, because what you're doing is you're constantly improving the experience of the folks that are interacting with these forms and these workflows. And so what I'm looking for now is, here we have all the bits and parts and bolts and nuts and so forth that need to be put together to serve those goals that I mentioned, such as registering a patient and collecting survey results. And the person to do that is the person that I'm going to pass the baton to right now, which is Andrew. Take it away, Andrew. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chuck, very much for filling us in there. Fun fact about this slide, that is, those are actually Chuck's and my hands. We flew them out here to get that picture. Actually, most of our webinar budget was spent on getting this, so feels like money well spent. But seriously, Chuck, I appreciate it, and I like that we're continuing the relay race metaphor. I'm going to go right into to my section here. As Chuck demonstrated, workflow can definitely be a helpful tool for healthcare, but there's a difference between a nice-to-have and a need-to-have. And the question is, which one is workflow, and specifically digital workflow? I'd argue that online workflow is on its way to becoming a need-to-have for healthcare organizations. There are several reasons for this, but the biggest one is inefficiency. Inefficiency is the #1 cause of both high cost and poor patient experiences within healthcare systems. 86% of the mistakes made in the healthcare industry are administrative, so which costs organizations over $19.5 billion and 400,000 lives per year. Inefficient patient scheduling alone costs more than $150 billion per year, and poor paper filing systems lead to patient charts going missing or being unavailable during 30% of visits, which means patients are forced to fill out their information over and over again. Now, nobody likes doing the same thing twice, and re-entry of the same data is one of the main items that patients point to when describing a negative experience. So data inefficiency not only costs you a lot of money, it also makes your patients unhappy. So let's talk a little bit about what you can do to fix it. Not surprisingly, from a webinar that is put on by FormStack, but online forms are a really great solution for fixing that problem. The first step would be turning your paper forms into digital ones. So this can help you cut costs, it can improve patient satisfaction, and it does that in 3 major ways. One is it streamlines your administrative tasks. The second is it makes information more easily accessible for both you and your patients. And the third is digital forms dramatically reduce data collection errors that can happen for reasons like bad handwriting, misplaced paper, and all kinds of other scenarios. So to help you understand and use online forms in the best way, we're going to share some best practices that you can follow. These best practices will show you how to streamline your paper forms into digital ones, how to integrate your forms with current systems and processes, and how to analyze and use information like patient surveys and other analytics to find helpful insights. Let's get started. So when using online forms, you should first look for opportunities to turn a stack of paper forms into one or two online forms. And there are a lot of reasons for that too, but one of the big ones is paper forms are expensive. When you look at the cost, providers process an average of 20,000 forms per year. Each paper document and organization files can cost about $20 each, which means paper forms alone can cost organizations up to $400,000 per year. You can reduce this cost significantly by turning a pile of paper forms into one or two online forms. Not to mention there's the added advantage of helping the environment or going green as well. One of the most common series of forms you probably have to deal with are patient registration forms. When a new patient visits your office for the first time, they have to provide you with a lot of information. Most organizations handle this process with multiple paper forms, hence the common patient frustration of having to fill out piles and piles of forms every time they visit a doctor's office. But if you handle this process online, you can collect all of that information in one or two streamlined web forms. What's more, because the forms are online, the patient can actually fill them out in the office, or they can fill them out before their visit so that you can send them a link once their appointment is set, and they can have all those forms filled out and ready to go actually in your hands before they even arrive. This is actually an example of what an online patient registration form could look like. Just quick note here, all the templates that we shared during the webinar will be made available to everyone when we send the webinar recording, so we'll send those out to you. And these are fully custom, so you can essentially replicate all the forms that you're already using in the software. You can also collect all of the information you need on these forms, so patients can upload their insurance card, their ID. At the bottom you can even collect their patient signature, so it's a pretty robust offering to replicate what you already pull. Sorry, this is the second half of that registration form. You can see here the signature line. This is another example of a registration form, and this one is similar to the one I showed before, but it focuses more specifically on collecting a patient's medical history. Something that could come in handy on forms like this, which Chuck mentioned earlier, is conditional logic. So conditional logic actually helps you show or hide form questions based on a person's previous answers. The nice thing about that is a form can look shorter and a lot less daunting to fill out because the patient will only see the questions that apply to them. So I'm sure you're familiar with the stack of forms, and only about half of that actually gets filled out by the patient because not everything applies to them. With conditional logic, you can get rid of a lot of those questions that may not be relevant, and then they're only filling out information that is relevant. You can see in this example the question, for instance, are there any bone fractures? So if the patient put yes, then you can see this follow-up question pops down here, which fractures have you experienced? And so that big box that allows them to kind of describe their past experience would not show up unless they had bone fractures. So the form gets a lot shorter, and it becomes a little less daunting of a proposition to fill out in full. Okay, moving on. Once you know which forms you are going to move online, you'll want to figure out how you can integrate with your systems and processes. If you're currently using an EMR, you probably agree it has some weak spots. There are things that the EMR doesn't do. Online forms can help you fill in the gaps that your EMR can't cover, so you can avoid having to scan paper documents into your system. You can see here there are a number of different processes that you can consider taking digital. These are the key ones that our clients seem to seem to be drawn to. Patient intake and registration, we talked about that one, obviously a big one. Incident reporting, patient experience, lead generation, record releases, and equipment ordering and repairs. Now, these are just ideas, but any paper forms that you have that are associated with the use cases listed here can obviously be made digital. You can also tie multiple processes together to address a bigger process like patient experience, which might combine a couple of different processes that you have, or administrative tasks, which might involve a couple of different handoffs. Let's use a medical release form as an example. Now, normally a medical release form needs to be filled out both by patients and providers, then routed to the most appropriate stakeholders. So if you do this on paper, it can be pretty easy to lose information or to make mistakes. But if you digitize the process, then everything can be done accurately and quickly. Here's an example of what an online medical release form might look like. So this template lets you collect all the necessary information for a medical release, including patient and provider signatures. Since you're collecting this information online, you can set up a pretty easy workflow that quickly sends data to the right people. Now let me show you an example of that. So essentially the provider fills out the form, and then as soon as that form is filled out, the confirmation email is sent to the patient and the provider upon a successful submission. That kind of cues it up for the patient to complete the form and sign it. And then once they do that, the submission data is routed to the appropriate stakeholders. That might be insurance providers, that might be a pharmacy, that might be a partner facility, it might be all three. But that workflow is automated based on the completion of those different forms. Show you another example. One of our clients is a telemedicine call center, and they use our system for intake and triage. In their workflow, the hospital calls to request a telemedicine doctor. They connect with dispatch, and then dispatch will take basic patient information, put it into our form, and then once that's complete, it's automatically sent over to triage. Now triage will add additional information, and then once that's submitted, it automatically sends both the dispatch information and the triage information over to the doctor. That doctor will review the information, and then ultimately they'll be in front of the patient performing the consultation. And then the doctor will take a separate form, add notes for the patient file, and send it to the hospital. So then the hospital has all three of those different forms that were filled out, and they can update the patient file. That's a pretty straightforward workflow, but it does touch a lot of different people, and it's a good example of how multiple stakeholders in multiple places can all get the same information. A lot of what we focused on is workflows for pre-visit and during visit processes, but post-visit follow-up is another area that's incredibly important to patients. The best part about this step is it helps you quantify everything you've done and gather some more actionable insights. The easiest way to do this is through online patient surveys. So data from patient surveys can reveal a wealth of information to help you improve your data collection and the overall patient experience. Adding workflow around that can even drive your patients or your staff to take specific action based on that feedback. So sending a form like this to your patients a day or two after their visit can be very helpful in learning how your practice can improve. A monthly or quarterly review of this data for patterns or common themes can be helpful in improving patient experience over time. Now, if you're using FormStack, you can gather other data with these types of surveys as well. Aside from the answers that your patients provide, you can also collect insights on deeper insights from your forms by looking for field bottlenecks. I believe Chuck mentioned those as well. Field bottlenecks are areas of your form that dissuade a user from filling it out. So a field bottleneck can be a question that your patient doesn't want to answer, doesn't know how, or just the simple fact that the form is too long. FormStack can help you identify and eliminate those bottlenecks and feed that data back to you so you can improve your form and workflow moving forward. I think patient surveys are really solid, but I found that automated follow-up workflow is even more valuable. And this is actually one of my favorite workflows that our medical organizations are using. And so this starts with sending out that survey that that a patient responds to, and then reacting automatically to that survey, to the results of that survey. So if the patient fills it out and in total it's a positive response, then you can automatically send the patient a review link to the medical review site that you prefer, basically saying, thanks so much for filling out the survey. Would you mind giving us a review? Now, that will only send out to the patients that have provided a positive response. If they send a negative response, then you can automatically send it to someone like a practice manager or someone else who might handle this sort of thing, and they can follow up with that patient, get a little bit of clarity, and see how they might improve in the future. Then again, if there's no response from the patient, automated reminders can be sent until that's complete or until a certain amount of time has passed. But it's very tough to manually follow up with your patients and get them to fill out a survey. But if you automate that, then you can take advantage of some of that workflow capability. So we've talked about these best practices using online forms in healthcare, but the big key question that Chuck mentioned as well is, what about HIPAA compliance? HIPAA compliance is obviously, like Chuck said, a go or no-go. It's one of the biggest reasons that healthcare organizations avoid cloud systems, and it's not hard to see why. HIPAA violations are expensive. The penalties are high, from $100,000 to $50,000 per violation. The maximum penalty is $1.5 million per year. Form solutions have historically been expensive as well. So before FormStack entered the space, providers often had to choose between using form solutions that were incredibly cost and labor intensive or were of questionable or no HIPAA compliance. So you can have affordable online forms and be truly HIPAA compliant as well if you choose the right provider. Whatever solution that you choose, these are some measures that you can take to ensure you're compliant even if you're using a cloud system. The first one is data encryption. So using advanced data encryption is the industry standard for collecting sensitive information online, and it's the only way that you can be HIPAA compliant. Setting up auditing and login lets you track user activity, who's accessed the data, when they accessed it, and what actions they performed while they were logged into the system. Another must-have for HIPAA compliance. Having user-level permissions. So user-level permissions let you control who sees what information. It's very important. And doing continual security and maintenance. Continual security maintenance is necessary to keep your system secure and maintain HIPAA compliant standards. I would say that one is probably the biggest reason that people don't attempt to do this in-house, even if they have an internal development team. Implementing and maintaining these things yourself can be overwhelming, which is why you should use a HIPAA compliant system that does it for you, like FormStack. So quick recap here before we get to questions. We've given you a lot of information. So here are some actions that you might take right away to start improving your workflows and your patient experience. The first step is identifying which forms you can take online. Patient registration is obviously a great place to start, but it's going to vary from provider to provider. Integrate online forms with your current systems and processes. So that means doing things like setting up confirmation emails, getting data routing, figuring out where your information needs to go and how you can get it there. The third one is taking appropriate measures to maintain HIPAA compliance. Obviously, that's the most important thing you can do when you're doing this kind of work. Our team at FormStack can certainly help you with this if you are interested. And with that, I want to hand it back to Lainey, and she can get us going with some questions that you might have. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Andrea and Chuck. And for the next 10 minutes or so, we're going to open up the floor for questions. So if you have a question for Andrew or Dr. Webster, please post it in the chat window in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, or tweet it at us via the FormStack Workflow hashtag. All right, first question coming in is from Mark. He said, you mentioned HIPAA compliance. Does this pertain to FERPA as well? and I will direct that question to Andrew.
Yeah, thank you. I would say workflow is good for anyone. So whatever your business and whatever processes you're currently doing, moving to a digital workflow I think is good no matter what. There's a lot of overlap between HIPAA compliance and FERPA compliance. FormStack has specifically been audited by a third party for HIPAA compliance, but a lot of those best practices overlap and cross over. Most of that would fulfill FERPA compliance as well. For most use cases, you'd be in good shape. So that's something that we'd want to look at more specifically for the use case that I believe it was Mark asked about. But in general, yes, workflow for FERPA, absolutely, and FormStack can put you in FERPA compliance as well in most cases.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark and Andrew. Second question was, where do these stats come from? This is on the slide where we're talking about how 86% of the mistakes made in healthcare are administrative. That stat was listed on Referral MD, but HIMSS was the original source of that. Our next question is, some HIPAA guidelines caution using email to transmit PHI. Is email with FormStack secure?
It probably makes sense for me to take that one too. And the short answer, yes, we do provide secure SMTP. So our HIPAA, the way that we handle HIPAA information, we can even pass it through email and it's still compliant.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrea. Next question is from Melanie. She said, we are a medical billing service for a dental practice. If we upload an attachment, is it on a HIPAA compliant server? And this is a two-part question. So Andrew, why don't you go ahead and answer the first part, and we'll go on with the second part too.
Okay. So the question was, if you upload attachments, are they on a HIPAA compliant server? Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And yes, the answer is yes. All of our attachments are transmitted and secured securely, and attachments that are secured through our HIPAA forms are also completely compliant.
Okay, and her follow-up was, we have a doctor upload an image of the DL and medical card. Will that image be on a HIPAA compliant server? So I guess that answers both of those. Thank you. Next question is for Chuck. What are some key metrics to associate or track with workflow?
Okay, can you hear me, Lainey?
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, the classic workflow metrics are cycle time, which is the amount of time from the beginning to the end of a workflow. And you can measure that by walking through the workflow, sitting in the call center or walking with the patient. Increasingly, that data is actually in the IT system, so your IT person will be able to pull that out of a log from your EHR. Throughput, which is the number of times the workflow can be executed within a period of time, which can translate into the number of HIPAA, the number of patient surveys that can be executed within an hour. And then, of course, you're interested in not only speed and efficiency, you're interested in outcome. And so what percentage of the workflows are deemed to have successfully completed? And then kind of the other side of that coin are rework rates. That is, how many workflows have to be started over again. And then there are other things like that have to do with cost. Like and this would come from a longer term. You'd look at it after a couple of months, and that is, did you reduce the number of full-time equivalents necessary to support a collection of workflows? User satisfaction scores. So that's an example right now that you get through the form, online form workflow technology itself. And those are, off the top of my head, those are kind of the classic workflow metrics.
Awesome. Thank you, Chuck. Next question is from Pete. He said, you mentioned FormStack is HIPAA compliant. Has FormStack also undergone other security measures and audits, such as SOC 1 or 2 type 2? Also, what measures are in place to protect my data that we are entering? Andrew, do you want to take that one too?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have not undergone the same audit for SOC 1 or 2. HIPAA compliance was a big focus for us, and so that's where we put a lot of our energy and time, and that's what we're specifically focused on. As far as what measures are in place to protect the data, we have SSL and encryption and all kinds of things. The best answer that I can give is probably to go to formstack.com/security, and you can see a lot of that laid out. You can also request our full security document, which really gets into the sort of the nitty-gritty information that that participant may be interested in finding out that others might be a little bored by.
And Pete is wondering, as a follow-up specifically, are third-party integrations like WebMerge also HIPAA compliant?
Yeah, great question. So we're actually going through what we did to become HIPAA compliant was actually pull out every third-party integration that we had, and we're basically putting them back into our system one by one. And so we're doing our due diligence on every third-party integration that we offer, and over time you'll see those individually come back into our HIPAA compliant offering.
Awesome. One question is coming in from Anne. She says, I share an account with about 20 other people. I'm one of the account admins, but is there a way to set up user-level permissions to keep other account admins out of specific folders and forms?
Yep, you can do individual user permissions for folders and forms.
Great. One other question for Chuck. How do you typically conduct a workflow assessment? What steps do you follow?
Well, I'm going to give you kind of the informal, and which means actually more practical version that I've done over the years, and that is you start off. In fact, there's a Harvard Business Review article written years ago called "Managing by Walking Around," in which is walking around and actually seeing what's going on. This is a little more structured than that, and that is you go to the beginning of the workflow, wherever that is. If it's the call center or it's the patient literally entering the physical building, and you go with them and you note all the steps, and perhaps even timing them, and you do that more than once because you want to get a sense of the variation in the workflow. And what you're doing is kind of internalizing the workflow, and then you start asking folks, what are the workflow pain points? Where are the delays? Where do things go wrong? But you have to take that with a grain of salt, okay? Because when people want to tell you that things are working great, regardless of whether they are or not. And then you need to ask about what are some guesstimates here? How long does it usually take? And how many have to be redone? And now what you do is you start drawing out the workflows, and it doesn't really matter. You just, in fact, Google workflow diagram. There's all kinds of relatively simple boxes and arrows, and you don't have to even use Viz.io or some fancy workflow drawer, although you're welcome to download one of those. They're available for free. And then you go and you show those to folks, and you say, well, how am I doing? And you get them to critique it. And then eventually, at some point, you kind of get people to sign off, and you gather them together, and you say, okay, everybody at once, look at this workflow, and let's now imagine we're stepping through the workflow. And does everybody agree? And because it's like the elephant, where folks think the elephant is the sixth blind man. So you've got the tree trunk, and the snake is the tail, and the side is a wall, and you kind of have to triangulate, get those all together. And then that's your current state workflow, and then you got to brainstorm. You say, okay, where can we eliminate steps? Where can we make steps faster? Where can we make them easier? And that's the future state workflow. And you show them that to the business analyst or the clinical analyst or whoever it is, or perhaps the individual from FormStack, and say, okay, can we do this? And at that point, you gather people again together and say, okay, well, this is what we have, this is what we think we can do, and then you have to build a consensus, and that is whether and how to proceed. There are more sophisticated tools that you can actually pull timestamp data out of electronic health records and other databases in your practice management system, and you can actually generate workflows automatically. But I would just start with something probably a little bit more systematic than on the back of a napkin. But an 8.5 sheet of paper works fine.
Great. Next question is from Darian. Is there a BAA that can be signed, not for individual organizations, but an organization that has healthcare clients who want form on their sites?
Yes. So all of our HIPAA compliance solutions require a BAA. We have a standard BAA that we use that fits most clients' needs. We have a subcontractor BAA that is more in line with what Darian may have been asking about, and we also will do a custom BAA for organizations that have more advanced needs.
Awesome. Next question also for Andrew. What are some common data collection errors to be aware of?
What are some common data collection errors to be aware of? I would say that is everything from the sort of simple rudimentary thing like people that have bad handwriting or human error, all the way up to just the number of times that information has to be transferred, re-entered, interpreted. All of those points are potential spots where you might see errors. And so obviously the number of times that you can take information once and then have that routed to the appropriate parties, obviously that's huge because the less times that information is entered and re-entered, the fewer times that leads to an error.
Awesome. Next question is from Cherie, also for Andrew. I have a client who must collect data on federal regulatory forms, FMCSA, that must look exactly like the printed or PDF version. Is it better to start in WebMerge or FormStack to achieve this?
And that was Cherie, is that what you said?
Yes.
Cool. I would say that's probably a good question for somebody on our healthcare team. It depends on a couple of different things. We work with WebMerge, and so it depends if they want to fill it out as if it looks like the PDF version or just the final needs to look like it. We can kind of arrange either, so it'd be a good conversation to have with somebody on our healthcare team.
Okay. Next question for Chuck. How has the patient experience improved since technology became more ingrained in healthcare workflows?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, you have to differentiate between kind of back-end workflows amongst the staff that the patients don't see and the front-end workflows that patients do see, because they're very different kettles of fish. What's happened with the introduction of sort of these digital touch points is that there's a much wider variety of different front-end experiences. And so some patients have access to their medical records and are conveniently reminded of appointments and other responsibilities, and they love that. And other patients find access to their data kind of cumbersome, and it's spread across multiple systems with different user interfaces. And at the same time, patient expectations have risen dramatically. So even though perhaps things are better, they have experienced even greater convenience as consumers outside of healthcare. But from their point of view, healthcare has not kept up. And that's what I see as one of the great values of workflow technology, including online form technology, is that it can provide a user-friendly layer of workflow in between the humans and the data. And so we're just starting to make this happen. And I'm kind of reminded of a quote from a famous science fiction author, I think last name is Gibson, in which he said, "The future is here, it's just not uniformly distributed." So wide variety of experiences, expectations are higher, and I think it's the workflow layer that's going to make this future more uniformly distributed.
Thank you, Chuck. Next question is from Twitter, from Shuri again. She's wondering if she can share this webinar with others. Yes, absolutely. We'll send you a link to the recording following the webinar, and you are absolutely welcome to share that on social media. Thank you. Next question is for Andrew. Can data from forms be plugged into graphic data analysis programs like Power BI, or does FormStack have its own graphical presentation of results?
Okay. The answer to that question, I believe, is yes and yes. I'm not specifically familiar with Power BI or BI. I'm not sure which one it is. But we can do export in a number of different formats, and so if one of those goes into Power BI, then that's ideal. Otherwise, we do have our own analytics area in the software where you can do some different things with graphical presentation, charts, and so forth.
Awesome. Another question for Andrew. Aside from patient registration, what are the other main reasons people use you?
There are a lot, actually. It's everything from sort of administrative. I showed that example of the patient satisfaction, sort of the other end of patient experience that comes after the visit that I think is a really strong one. I think we had that slide that talked about the different use cases, and I would say go back and look at those. Those are good examples, but anywhere that you have a paper process or a process where you're taking information and re-entering it or sending it to multiple parties, that's probably an opportunity to use FormStack to create a workflow that will improve your efficiency.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's see. Another question on FERPA from Mark. Does FormStack have FERPA confidentiality agreements with colleagues and institutions?
I actually don't know the answer to that question.
All right, Mark,
we certainly
can find out
if you want to have a conversation with us. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, well, we're pretty much at our time. So if you have any other questions, feel free to follow up over email at the end of the webinar. And I just wanted to take this time to thank our speakers again for joining us. Chuck and Andrew, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. And thanks so much to everyone who attended. We'll be sending out the webinar recording InForm templates via email within the next few days. And let me change the screen really quick. These are the FormStack templates that you'll be receiving. So just look out for those in the next few days over email. And thanks again for joining.
This concludes today's
Thanks,
call.
everyone.
Thank you for your participation. You may now
Bye-bye.
disconnect.